It's a real privilege to welcome you all tonight to a very special evening. This is the first event, and we're a little bit premature, but not much, in the Smithsonian celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month of 2010. I'm Virginia Mecklenburg. I'm one of the senior curators here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I'd like to just say a couple of things about the Latino program here. The museum has had a very long-standing commitment to showing Latino art, ranging from exhibitions of Santos and Chicano art back in the 1960s and 1970s, to a collection that we've been working on for a number of years that now numbers pretty close to 500 objects by Latino artists. They range chronologically from, actually the earliest work in our collection is a painting of Santa Barbara that was made and created in Puerto Rico in the 1670s. It's not a lot of American art that dates to the 1670s. To wonderful things like the great kitschy chandelier that's hanging in Lincoln Gallery on the 3rd floor by Popón Osorio. It's one of everybody's favorites. Luis Jimenez's Vaquero stands at the G Street entrance because we wanted a symbol that Latino art is an essential part of what we all consider our polyglot American heritage. Tonight, I am really pleased to be able to make a very special announcement. With the collaboration and support of our friends and colleagues at the Smithsonian Latino Center, we are hiring our first long-term curator of Latino art. It's my pleasure to introduce Carmen Ramos, who will join the museum staff officially on October 12th as our new curator of Latino art. So no longer do people have to, be sustained with my limited knowledge. Carmen is a distinguished scholar. I might just note here that she will be awarded her PhD from the University of Chicago in just, a little over a month or month and a half. She's an accomplished curator, a lecturer, and a writer, and so will be a wonderful, wonderful addition to our curatorial team. We're thrilled that she's agreed to lead the program, to build the collection, and we're all looking forward to an exhibition that she will be organizing that will probably take place in the fall of 2013 or shortly thereafter, and then travel to museums all over the country. Please join me in welcoming Carmen Ramos. Carmen?
Thank you, Virginia, for such a warm welcome. And I'm going to keep my comments brief. I am so thrilled to be here on a number of levels. I'm so happy to be able to share this platform with such wonderful artists that will be hearing in a few moments. And I am honored and humbled to be put in the position to interpret the collection here, the burgeoning collection, the growing collection, and I look forward to working with my colleagues at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, at the larger Smithsonian Institution, and with the Smithsonian Latino Center in building and expanding this collection and deepening the representation of Latino culture here at the nation's capital. So thank you so much.
Tonight's program, I need my clicker here, which we're calling Intersections or Intersecciones, features 4 photographers whose work has been widely recognized for its beauty, its insight, and its power. These people have come to talk with us tonight about issues having to do with personal identity, with Latino identity, and with what it means to be a woman artist of Latino or Latin American or Hispanic descent living and working in the United States today. I especially want to thank Eduardo Diaz and his colleagues at the Smithsonian Latino Center for making tonight's program possible. I'd also like to thank Nona Martin and the staff of the Public Programs Office for presenting these remarkable events that they do week after week and month after month. I'd also like to salute the center, the Smithsonian Latino Center, for providing a vision that ensures that the Smithsonian fulfills the promise inherent in our role as the country's national museum, that we represent, expand, and explore all aspects of our cultural heritage. Our moderator tonight is Muriel Hasbun, whose work I think probably most of you well know. Muriel is an associate professor and associate chair of the photography department at the Corcoran College of Art and Design here in Washington. But Muriel hasn't always been a photographer. You may be surprised to hear once you've had a chance to see some of her images. She did a bachelor's degree in French literature at Georgetown University, and then acknowledged her real calling by enrolling in the MFA program at George Washington University, where she completed her degree working with Ray Metzger. Muriel, I have to tell you, is having an absolutely remarkable career, particularly for one so young. Her work has been shown in the United States and Europe and throughout Latin America. She was featured, and this is, truly groundbreaking, in the 50th Venice Biennale in 2003. She's also received an incredible number of fellowships and awards. And from 2006 through 2008, she was honored by the Department of State as a Fulbright Scholar. As you can see from these images and a couple more, Muriel explores the intricacies and emotional reverberations of identity in her art. For her, photography is an apt medium for exploring personal history. And these histories, they're histories that cross borders, that cross cultures, and that cross generations. Memory and legacy are ongoing themes, as are notions of silence and erasure. In much of her work, she has constructed narratives, but she also creates spaces in which dialogue between individual and collective memory raise new questions about identity and place.
I'm originally from El Salvador. My family comes from different places, though. My father was born in El Salvador, but his parents are Palestinian Christians who came from Bethlehem at the beginning of the 20th century. And my mother is French, and she was born in France of Polish Jewish parents. And so both families emigrated to El Salvador, and I was born there and grew up there, and then came to the US later. And so it influenced my work in that it really, personally, I wanted to find out more about my heritage and more about my cultural background and religious background, and began investigating my family history through my work. A photograph records what was there and that is no longer there is what always attracted me to photography. Photography is known for being very descriptive, but at the same time, it alludes to what isn't there anymore. And so it's a document of a particular time and a particular place, and of a person in ways that makes it really powerful to create a dialogue with the past.
It's a very great pleasure to present Muriel Hasbun.
Thank you, Virginia. Is my mic on? I'm not sure if I'm speaking to this one or the other one. Okay, great. It's really wonderful to be here, an honor to be here. Thank you for coming on this wonderful evening where we're going to be having this conversation about what it means to be an artist, a Latina artist, and an artist in general. I really want to thank Nona Martin and Tierney Sneeringer for organizing this event, and Virginia Mecklenburg for wonderful introduction, thank you. And the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Latino Center. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I was doing a little thinking about, what does it mean to be a Latina artist? And actually last night with some of the artists, we started the conversation so that we would be warmed up for tonight. I'm kind of starting with this thought on the title of the program, Intersections or Intersecciones. By definition, intersection is the place where things meet, or where two or more roads cross, or where, if you think about it mathematically, where lines or planes cross one another. So this implies a place, a locus, a sort of encounter, an encounter that could be a clash, or a joining, or a meeting, a coming together, and sometimes it alludes to the acceptance of something at the expense of another. It can also relate to a back and forth, a crossing over. In really in a few words, it always relates to a constant negotiation and an in-betweenness. I see it as a place where differences might intersect to create a common space. So that is the mindset that we will be exploring today. It's the encounter between past and present, between collective history and personal history or personal memory, between document and the imagination, between a variety of cultures and worldviews, which we could simplify for the sake of this panel, between Anglo culture and Latino culture, or between English and Spanish. Funny though, it is only when I came to the United States that I became a Latina. I grew up in El Salvador. The label did not apply when I lived there. I was born into an immigrant family in El Salvador, pejoratively referred to as turca by the general Salvadoran population, yet not fully accepted by either the Palestinian Christian community of my father's family or by the Jewish community that first welcomed my French Jewish mother when she arrived in El Salvador. You see, it's complicated. It's never so simple. So we each have become who we are by a different set of circumstances and origins. And although in the US, Hispanics or Latinos are seen as a monolithic group, for starters, as you probably already know, there are 5 major groups who have come to this country. Chicanos or Mexican Americans, the largest group at 13.3 million, more or less, growing. Central Americans, about 2.6 million. Puerto Ricans, about 2.2 million. Cubans, about 1 million. Dominicans and other Caribbean nationalities, about 1.4 million. And there's a conglomerate also of South Americans from different countries as well. So who are we, these Latino artists? Do we consider ourselves Latino? Ilan Stavans, and in the introduction to Growing Up Latino, Memories and Stories, a compendium of short stories, refers to Latino and other ethnic writers in the US as cultural interpreters, living in both cultures at once and with allegiances to both. And that term, cultural interpreter, I like it. I respond to that. I feel a certain resonance to it. I think that the term assumes a certain translation, a renegotiation in the process of reinventing oneself, and alludes to the construction of something new, a new place, a new identity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the work of, oops, this was the last of mine, of Martina Lopez. We begin with Martina Lopez. And Martina Lopez is Associate Professor of Art, Associate Chairperson, and Director of Graduate Studies, Department of Art and Art History and Design at Notre Dame University. Lopez has been working with the 19th century portrait, landscape, and the digital media since 1985. Her interest in electronic environment lies in the believability of the photograph and also in the malleability of the digital medium. For the last several years, she has been interested in the idea of the digital one-of-a-kind image. Lopez's artwork has been featured in such publications as Aperture Magazine and Naomi Rosenblum's A World History of Photography. Most recently, her work was included in The Digital Eye by Sylvia Wolf, director of the Henry Art Gallery. Lopez has received several grants, including a National Endowment for the Arts Visual Arts Photography Fellowship, and her work is in many, many private collections and public collections, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, Arizona.
I grew up in Seattle, born and raised. My parents grew up in Isleta, Texas, and my father was in the military, and they moved from Texas to California to Seattle. I describe my work as a visual diary. They're things that I'm thinking of, things that have happened, not necessarily a narrative, but suggestive of the mood or ideas that I'm thinking of. Photography is, I just love the way that it's so pliable. I was introduced to the computer making pretty early on, and it just seemed to mesh. The issues of identity are pretty interesting, and it's made me think about, how I see myself, and realizing that your identity is constantly changing. Not necessarily Latino, but having those conversations, it certainly comes out in the work. There's elements in there that I don't think of, but are inherently part of my culture.
Maria Martinez-Cañas was born in Havana, Cuba. She received a BFA in photography from Philadelphia College of Art and an MFA in photography from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She has worked with innovative, non-traditional photographic media and has exhibited widely in the US and abroad with 34 one-person exhibitions and over 250 group exhibitions. Maria is the recipient of a Cintas Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Award, and also a Fulbright Hays Grant, among others. Her works are included, this is in Miami, right? Miami Airport? In Miami Airport, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Philadelphia, the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, the San Francisco Museum, the Center for Creative Photography, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and the National Museum of American Art, as well as the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And here you see some of her works, and her work is represented by Julie Saul Gallery, Frederick Snitzer in Miami, Schneider Gallery in Chicago, and the Santos Gallery in Houston.
My family is from Cuba originally. I was born in Cuba, grew up in Puerto Rico, and been in this country since 1978. I describe myself to be a photo-based artist. I work with the medium of photography, but I always challenge myself in the notion of what I want photography to be, considering to be looked at. I think that because of that, I couldn't say that I sometimes don't even call myself a photographer. I call myself an artist that worked with the medium of photography, the medium that I love very much. I think the primary issues regarding the art panel today is the issues of identity, of being a Latin or Latina artist. I in a way, I see it more like a, like questioning that search for an identity that I think as somebody who has a Latin background, we have all gone through at one time or another in our lives.
Kathy Vargas, she was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, where she still lives. She began photographing in 1971 under the guidance of rock and roll photographer Tom Wright. She attended San Antonio College in the mid-1970s and was mentored by painter Mel Casas, who invited her to join the Chicano art group Consafo. She eventually transferred from SAC to the University of Texas at San Antonio, where she majored in art with a concentration in photography, and she received a BFA in 1981 and an MFA in 1984. And from 1985 to 2000, she worked as the visual arts director of the Guadalupe Art Center in San Antonio. And in 2000, she became the chair of art at the University of the Incarnate Word and is currently associate professor and chair of the department.
I'm from San Antonio, Texas. My family has lived there for a long time. My father's family was in Texas since it was Tejas, and they came around 1830. My mother's family comes from Zacatecas, and they came over in 1910, 1920, around the time of the Revolution. A lot of my work is about my family. There was one big series that I just finished called Este Recuerdo, which was about both sides of the family going back several generations, well, about 3 generations, as far back as I could trace it. But just the cultural influence is very big in my work, and that's all family. Physically, it's double exposures done on a 4x5 camera. It's still darkroom, and it's hand colored. thematically, my work is about the life, death, resurrection process. I do believe in resurrection and remembrance. But honestly, it's also about social justice. It's also about political themes sometimes. So it's a little bit about everything. It's about the artistic and the ethereal and the ephemeral, but it's also about the concrete and the political and the topical.
I thought that we should start the conversation by asking each other whether we consider ourselves Latina artists.
If someone asked me my background, or I would say I would second generation Mexican American, as a because I was raised in Seattle and don't speak Spanish, so or very little if I. So I always felt a little uncomfortable to be called a Latina. And we were just talking about Kathy, and you were saying...
I was saying that I've always thought of myself as a Chicana because it's more specific culturally, but it's also a political meaning. And I've always been political ever since I was a little girl. So for me, it's much more natural to call myself a Chicana, and it's also more specific.
I consider myself to be, and I think that is, in a way, it's more about place, if we think about it. I think I have had people calling me Latina, which I don't have any problem with it, but when I'm asked, who am I? I have always said that I'm a Cuban-born, Puerto Rican-grown American citizen. And, for me, those three things are the most important for understanding the way that I relate to the world, to the environment and the world, the outside world. So Latina, yes, but at the same time, place, I think, is much more important for me.
Yeah, I guess I would link the place to the events that made us who we are. The events in those places, I think, might be really important to kind of ground that sense of identity. In some cases it's dramatic, in others it's not as dramatic. I left El Salvador because of the civil war there, so it's kind of a dramatic event. And in your case, Maria.
Yeah, my family left Cuba because they had no other choice, and it's interesting because you use the word immigrants, from your family, and immigrants has never been a word. The word that was really present in my life was exile, and that's a very different word for me, because immigrant is almost like you wanted to come here. We had, the way that I have always seen it is that we have no other choice but to come here, or to go to whatever country accepted us, and in this time, in this case, or in my case, it was the United States. But I left Cuba, my parents left Cuba when I was only 3 months old. I never been back, not because I don't want to, but because I can. And this is a very personal opinion. I can't forget the reason why I was not allowed to be born in the country that I was born in. And now, even now, you ask, one of the first questions that we had is, what is home? And if I have to really say what is home, home is here for me. I've been an American citizen for 30 years, and this is where I feel that I belong. I think that we are all, we belong here. We are a little different, but I think that that's the beauty of the United States. That is, multiculturalism, and we're very different, and I love that.
Well, it's funny that you talk about this exile. And to come to a place that's safe. My parents wanted something. They grew up outside of El Paso, very poor, and wanted something better for us. So they moved to California and then up to the Northwest. And I grew up very American. But it is that, that desire for someplace safe to become for something else. And I think in our work in particular, there's this connection to the land.
Right.
That is, a longing or to a grounding of who we are.
Right.
See, and for me, San Antonio has always been home. And I think, I've gone away for short periods and then gone back because there's something very comforting about living in a place where you're the majority. So San Antonio is somewhere between 55 and 60% Latino. And so that my culture, everything I need, in a sense, all of the strength that I need is in that place. So even if I go away, I take it with me, but I always go back because that's where I belong. My mother's family came there in the 1910s because of the Mexican Revolution. They needed to leave. They had literally lost all of their men in 1 week. They, my uncle, my grandfather, there were 4 of the men in the family were all killed at once. And so the women literally, and the 2 or 3 little boys they had picked up and left. And they just kept going north. My father's family has been in Texas since it was Tejas. As we always say, the border crossed them. So it's really home. It's very much home.
Yeah. No, I think that the whole idea of migrations or movements or exiles, I mean, and, I said immigration, but, it is definitely, the reasons why immigration happens is many times, because of some violent war or something like that. And in the case of my father's family, it was because of World War I. They were Palestinian Christians and they didn't want to fight with the Ottomans, in Bethlehem. So they left and landed in El Salvador. But, so it's sort of like this, and then, I left because of war as well. But there's this kind of complex reasons of always wanting to find like a place that is where one can actually become who one wants to be, for home. And as artists, I think that our work becomes part of that place where we actually construct our home, or like you're saying, Martina, the land, or like trying to find what that land is. And I'm really curious, actually, in your case, there's always these wonderful backdrops to the portraits. Do they have specific significance, or do you?
They're very fabricated, and some of them are very. I live in Michigan City, Indiana, on Lake Michigan, so some of those are from the winter or the very. I'm very connected to the land. Seattle is so beautiful, and it's a part of me.
Some of it looks like El Paso. The mountains
it's
and
the barren quality
and then a few
of it.
Mountains in the background, hills.
And they're completely made up. So.
But you mentioned a particular longing in reference to it. So
there is a longing. I think I always see the land as a historical marker that through generations the land has existed, and so there is a history to it, and I'm connected to the land and the place that my parents were, but I think of it as more of our ancestors and not my specific family. So there's a comfort in that they're there.
And I think that also I know that for me, at least in my 20s, the sense of place and belonging was the most important thing. And I utilized my work in order to come to terms with that search for a personal identity that I felt that I needed, because I felt very Cuban, even though I have only lived 3 months of my entire life in Cuba. And I think that in that sense, I needed to understand, why that was the case. but eventually, once you realize who you are, it's almost like you need to move on into the other issues that make you who you are. And that was very important. I think the sense of the organic and the earth, is very, it was also important to deal with.
Right.
Well, it's greater than us.
Exactly. Well, there's the cycle of life and a regeneration that's implied as well by it. So I think that makes sense.
Right.
And kind of linked, I think, to that idea of the land as having a particular history and a memory. There's also, I think we all use archives in some way or another, family albums or other kinds of documents. And what I wanted to do is, because I was reading this little short story and just kind of read you a little excerpt from it, because I was very touched by it, and we can have this conversation about archives. It's a short story called The Ruins by Patricia Preciado Martin. And so there's a young girl who goes to this open space every day, and all of a sudden there's this old lady that appears to her. And so the old lady says, "Ven mi hija, ya es la hora." Come, my daughter, it's time. Doña Luz addressed Alma. So notice, luz and alma. Luz is light and alma is soul. Those are the names of these two women. Doña Luz addressed Alma in Spanish in an urgent musical voice. She takes her somewhere and she says, "Tú estás encargada de todo esto. It is your responsibility, all of these things." When Alma's eyes had focused and become accustomed to the smoky room, she distinguished through the haze, not moths, but shreds of paper on which notes had been carefully and laboriously written in a spidery crawl. Doña Luz continued to explain in a whisper, "This is the history of our people which I have gathered, the land grants and the homesteads and the property transfers, the place names of the mountains and the rivers and the valleys and the pueblos, the families and their names and their issue," and it goes on to list all of these different things. The recipes, the herbs and the cures, the music and the songs and the dances, the prose and the poems, the sorrows, the joys, the gain and the loss. This is my legacy, but I am old and failing. I entrust it to you lest it be lost and forgotten. And so it's just, I've in all of our work, I think that, we have that kind of, adherence to the actual document, which in many cases is a photograph. And so the lady, the girl, actually, Alma, stops to pick up some tattered scraps that lay at her feet, and she starts reading some deeds of land and different kinds of things, and even songs and poems. And it ends really beautifully. It says, "The unfinished song flew from Alma's hands when suddenly and without a warning, a tornado-like gust blew open the unlocked door of Doña Luz's hovel. The airborne flakes blasted in with a ferociousness, and then Alma saw, helpless and aghast, that the shreds of precious paper, in an avalanche of blinding whiteness, had metamorphosed into giant white moths again. They quickened with life and took to the air in a dizzying funnel of flight. Blowing snow mingled with blowing paper and rose and fell and then eddied into a blizzard of memories. And then the memories and the spirit of Doña Luz fluttered out the open door in 1,000 swirling fragments in the direction of the south wind somewhere west of Aztlán." So it's just, like it's this whole complex thing that we want to hold on to something, but then at the same time it's so elusive. And I think that impetus is in some ways has been in different bodies of work that we've all dealt with. And so maybe you can talk about that.
Well, the thing with archives, or at least the way that I have always approached the photographic image. I know that in my case, images were really important at an early age because that was the way that my parents presented or introduced me and my sisters to family members that we never got to meet because of the separation of the families because of the revolution. But, what I found interesting is that, there are times that I have photographic images that are family photographic images that I know nothing of who the members of this photograph, who are the people or the identity of this photograph. So what happens is I create the story. You know, I invent in a way. It's almost like this absolute memory that I create that I know is not real because I don't have anything to confirm really what it is. And I think that in a way, you know, we know that photography, I mean, it is evidence, but at the same time, I mean, photography lies, and we know that. You know, that we normally should not trust 100% a photograph.
Right.
So I can invent, and especially now with the internet, we can invent our lives completely. And it's very intriguing because it's almost like you take away, in a way, the power of the photographic image.
It all becomes a fantasy. It all becomes something that is evolving constantly, that the light reshapes itself and becomes something else. I guess I'm interested in family photos and archives because of what may have happened after them more than anything else. Some of the people I can identify, I've been looking through old family photos recently for a series, excuse me, a series I'm doing on children. But what's interesting to me is that I don't know what happened to these people. I know who they are, I can identify them. My family used to love to write on the back of photographs, so I know who everybody was. But I don't know what became of them because the family went to Laredo and then came to San Antonio and then kept going north, and they went to Michigan and they went to other places. And I don't know what became of all these people because the family itself has lost track of them. And so it's wonderful to look at the photos and say, well, what happened to you? What became of you? It's interesting because I'm interested in family photos because you guys were talking about the land, and I was remembering that my great-great-grandfather had a huge plot of land when the land was Mexico. When the land became Texas, through eminent domain, he lost a lot of it. So for me, people are much more important to grasp onto. The people stayed, even when the land went away. And so I'm interested in those family photos because of that sense that they are connected to family, but then again, I don't know where they went. And photographs absolutely lie, so I can make up my own stories about what might have happened to people.
Right. And yet, you know, they have that incredible power that, you know, they're like the actual light that reflects off a person when they're standing there. So, you know, they're, like Susan Sontag said, the umbilical cord, you know, that links us to those people. I mean, they have that power, yet they look very much alike, and so they can also lie.
Right. My photographs, I don't even know who the people are, so I collect them and make up stories about them. But for me, I grew up as, you know, I'm one of 8 children. And I have 4 brothers and 3 sisters, and all my sisters are 5'1" and darker complected. And so I'm not 5'1". And my brothers and sisters would always tease me that I was adopted because I'm fairer skinned than they are. And then my mom never argued and never said, you know, anything. But who's going to adopt another child when they have 8 children, right? So my mom gave me a photograph, and she said, look, this is your Aunt Claudia. She's both tall and fair, and instantly connected me to that heritage. And that power of that photograph to make me feel like I belonged, you know, is still to this day so powerful.
Right. That's amazing. Yeah, and also where there's, I think, incredible loss, like in the case of my Jewish family, who mostly, you know, was killed in the Holocaust, there is that sense of the photographs actually containing a part of those people. So family stories in relation to those archives, you know, so we say that, you know, some of these things that we bring to the photograph are part of these family legacies, but on the other hand, they also are inventions and part of our imagination. And so how does that dialogue between what's fact and what's fiction come together in our work? You know, how does that create the space for the images to actually begin to say something about a particular narrative or about a particular identity that makes us who we are?
Well, family stories for me have been always very important. I mean, I remember sitting, I was sat next to my parents and hear them tell stories, not to me necessarily, but to other people that were in the house. And I would try to not miss a word, because it was another way for me to, it's almost like you start creating your life from the things and the memories and the stories that my parents were telling me. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it was really, as a child in particular, understanding, the where we come from, the roots, what the iconography and those visual elements that belong to where I come from. That was really important. Mm-hmm. Understanding that, I love the idea that I grew up in Puerto Rico, that I was able to maintain my native language. And I was saying yesterday in the dinner that Spanish for me is an emotional language. It's a language that I speak when I feel the most vulnerable. And then English language is the one that I speak when I'm it's like business for me. Mm-hmm. I feel the safer when I speak English and the more vulnerable when I speak Spanish. And so the stories in itself, if they deal with family, they were a way for me to give, it's almost like you're creating an individual, and just by having, memories and mention of stories, you give a three-dimensional mm-hmm. Aspect to that person, and right. and an identity more than anything, because sometimes I even wonder if the stories are all true, because
they become part of the myth of the family, or
it's the idea. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I remember when I went back to Puerto Rico after so many years that I've been out, and the road that I thought that it was huge ended up being a small, very road, and so you wonder, are the memories? Do we have that ability that we can distort memory? And does the memories and the stories that my parents gave me, are they for real? So that in itself, it was something that I now question. I don't tell them, but I know that I question.
They'll know now.
Because, they're not here. But, I always wonder if, how much of the truth, and I imagine because, life is so complex, and, like you said, it is complicated. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it's like, what is it, about the past? Is the past really the way that it was told?
Mm-hmm. And for me, it's interesting because there were 3 levels of family stories. Okay, on my mother's side, my grandmother told my mother didn't tell stories, but my grandmother did. And there were 2 types of stories. They would sit down and gossip. That was the first level. And he'd say, oh, did you know that your cousin, I won't say her name, her husband left her. He's gone, he's not gonna come back. And what are you gonna do with those 2 little boys? All of that. So there was the contemporary upheaval of the moment, whatever it was. There were also my grandmother's ghost stories. She lived through the revolution. She fled during the revolution. She saw a lot of murder and violence and mayhem. She never talked about it. If we asked her to tell us about the revolution, she would tell us ghost stories. So she would say, oh, we stayed in this house in wherever they were for a time being, and we would hear chains rattling, and they told us that there was money buried and there were ghosts, and I saw this or I saw that, or your aunt saw this or that. There was a little boy and he'd come down the hill and he came into the house and then he disappeared. So it's interesting because for me, my artwork is full of all these ghosts and supernatural mm-hmm. things, but it's because this is what I heard when I was a little girl. And then from my father's side of the family, they were always talking politics because I had an uncle who was part of the Democratic Party, and so he'd come in and always tell stories about this congressman and that senator and who was running for president, who was running for, this was during the time of LBJ. So there was a lot of interesting Texas politics going on. So there were those stories. So it was like, there was gossip, and then there were the spiritual stories that were never real, and then there were the political stories that were current events news. So it was an interesting mix of stories.
And were those stories told in English or in Spanish?
Both. My grandmother's stories were always in Spanish, the gossip was English and Spanish, and the politics was always in English. So there you have it.
I wonder if that's where the collage comes in.
I think so. Oh yeah, totally.
The layering.
Actually, that was one of my questions.
But we haven't gotten to your stories yet.
Well, my stories or my images aren't my personal family history stories. They're things that I'm probably thinking in my subconscious. I started using family photographs and then moved away from that. But one of them was when I was 4 years old, I had a brother who was killed in Vietnam, and I had never had memories of him. So it was only through the photograph that I could understand him. And so all the images that I've collected, and I don't know them at all. None of these people I know. So from that ability to understand him, I think I have this connection to other people, or the idea of these people as relating to as ancestors. So that's where the work comes from, is a much more, because I don't know them, I think I'm a little freer to make up stories. I'm not tied to any specific history.
Mm-hmm. I have been especially, looking in thinking about family stories, many of the stories that made part of my family life were actually silent. They were stories that were never told because they were too traumatic to actually talk about, like the Holocaust stories, or, so silence was kind of part of that legacy, and so there was an emotional transmission of something that there were only hints for them, but because of those hints gave me something. They gave me like my piano teacher was a Holocaust survivor, and she had the tattoo on her forearm. So those kinds of visuals, made me who I am. And as an adult, I began to put them together with the family photos or with the stories that I then investigated on my own, through other people. But there's also this term that the scholar Marianne Hirsch, she speaks about post-memory, and it's this whole idea of memories that are transmitted through a family that are not necessarily lived by one, but they're inherited nonetheless. The emotional or subjective quality of those things are inherited. And so in all of our histories, there is some traumatic, event or distance or loss that actually nurtures, the work eventually, or the construction of something. And I find that to be really fascinating, and how some of it is definitely rooted in what is real and what we lived, but also the imagination comes in and fills in the gaps to create something that becomes something new and constructed. Kind of going back a little bit to the whole idea of English and Spanish, there's this great little description by Ilan Stavans about English and Spanish, and so it talks about the clash between the North and the South. And to the North, a triumphant culture with its eyes to the future, the product of Puritan British pilgrims convinced they were the new Israel, a chosen people destined to inhabit the Eden across the Atlantic. To the South, a stumbling civilization fixated on the past, the illegitimate child of Iberian conquistadores, thirsty for golden power, and Indian mothers raped while the crucifix stood as witness. Language is useful in contrasting both world views. Spanish, labyrinthine in nature, has at least 4 conjugations to address the past. The lone future tense is hardly used. One can portray a past event in multiple ways, but when it comes to one of tomorrow, a speaker in Buenos Aires, Lima, Mexico City, and Caracas has little choice. The fact is, Hispanics, unable to recover from history, are obsessed with memory. English, on the other hand, is exact, matter-of-fact, mathematical. Spanish makes objects female and male, while in English the same things lack gender. As if one were not enough, Spanish has 2 verbs for to be, One used to describe permanence, another one to refer to location and temporality. So to be or not to be is inhabited in Spanish by a double, never self-negating, clear-cut meaning, to be or not to be alive, or to be or not to be here. So anyway, it's the complication of like this whole, two mindsets coming together, which is really interesting in the way that we can kind of tell our stories. And I find it interesting that, we're all of us in some way or another, be it digital or analog or, darkroom work or whichever, or experimental work, we use photo montage or collage in our work. And I wonder whether, that might be a way of perhaps expressing or better expressing the complexity of the experience.
I don't know. I don't
know.
I have no idea about a complete answer regarding that, but I think the process of layering, for the way, at least the way that I have always seen is a way of building up to something. I can start with an idea, or not even an idea. I can start with a feeling that I need to work on something. I have no idea why that is the case, but I know that the way that I work is that I need to do this. It's a very impulsive situation. I have always felt that it's very childish in a way, because I don't know if it's going to work or not, but something is telling me you need to do it. The layering aspect is the building up of that process, and I see it very much as part, the creative process. I can give it meaning as I, erase even aspects of it, and that for me is something that, it's the way that I work, and the way that I feel more in tune in creating the work.
What do you think?
For me, it's the layering is about time. But time is also about culture, because my father especially was always, and my mother too in her own way, they were always going back to an indigenous past, which is way back, hundreds of years back, maybe millennia back. And so they were always bringing it forward. It was always a superimposition on the present, whatever the present was. So it was about the past. I completely relate to that passage, because it was about a past that was irrevocably gone. Spain came to Mexico and it was over. And everything changed. And so when I especially if I'm going to call myself a Chicana, I have to think of that indigenous past.
Right.
But then I also think about the indigenous present, what's happening, or what has happened in Chiapas, what's happening now, especially in Mexico, Guatemala, but also Salvador, all of the places that are in turmoil, that have been in turmoil, certainly during my adult years. And so that is a constant layering of time. And that's what I'm looking at with the layering.
Yeah. I always see this dialogue between past and present as part of the relationship in the photographs, or choosing elements,
Yeah, I have to agree that for me, I think it may not be a real time and place, but an imagined time and place, sort of where all things intersect. And so that, as if a memory from the someone from the past, or that they may not be aware, but they're here.
Right. They all surface
it's
together.
It's a very sort of spiritual way of thinking about other people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's almost as if that dialogue between absence and presence is where the photograph is made, It's like that's the place. Yeah. I find that really powerful.
Everybody's still present in the way. They're all speaking to each other. And get that from your photographs, that there's this conversation going on among people who may never have met.
And in reality, that really is. I mean, they've made such an effect, but yet you never knew them.
Right.
So one of the things you had brought in on your questions was about loss.
Right.
And I think, although I've lost a lot of my, traditional characteristics of being a Latino, the way that a Mexican or Hispanic deals with death is very present, I think. You talk about it in your work, and I as a kid, I remember my mom telling me about her mother and what she went through, and how, as Americans, I don't think they deal with death in the same way.
Right.
And I know that's a profoundly strong part of who I am. To deal with it in a very matter-of-fact experience. And the idea of loss is a way that we make our work, and we, come to terms with things.
Right.
And it's funny because for me, loss is a very visual memory. From the beginning, from watching, I had a good friend who passed away of AIDS, and he, this would have been in the 80s, and he was in the hospital. It was the last few days, and we were there. We were physically present. And so we were close to watching him die. I mean, literally, he was maybe a day away. When my grandmother got sick the first time, she died, and then she was revived, but she was dead for a number of minutes, and I happened to be the one in the room when she died, so I watched her go through that process, and then I watched the doctors bring her back. It was amazing. And then, of course, when my mother passed away, by the time that my mother passed away, which would have been in '96, I understood that for me to recognize death, I literally had to see it. And by the time she passed away, I had to photograph it. And it's really weird because I think we understood each other very well. Because I asked her, she was in hospice care, and I asked her if I could photograph her. Her body had changed. And so I remembered her one way when she was my mom, when I was little and she was strong and healthy. And now I was seeing her another way. And I asked her, can I photograph you? And she said, it's the most telling thing. She said, whatever you need to do to deal with this and to understand it, go ahead and do.
Wow.
Because she understood that as a photographer, I knew about things through seeing them through a camera.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's so powerful.
Yeah, my mom would have never said that.
Never.
We Cubans deal with death very different. Yeah.
I photographed my father the last week before he died, and he left. It occurred to me when he was dying that I wanted to do these paper boats with him, and actually it was a way of speaking with him about his life. And so I photocopied family photos and documents and things, and we made the paper boats together. And so I videotaped him while he was doing this, and I made it. I mean, the last image one of the last images that you saw, Barquitos de Papel, is a video piece that is in honor of his life and him in memoriam. But it's also, kind of this reflection on how photography helps me, or, how I use photography to interpret what's happening. And so
There's a wonderful quote by Dwayne Michaels. I photograph to explain the world to myself.
There's a quote, I thought, that I found, Martina, in the internet, so I don't know if it's true, if you really said it, but it said, on the internet. My images have become a visual diary, a place where I come to terms with life.
That's true. That's actually true. I always tell my students that, I'd be totally crazy if it wasn't for my work.
Well, I feel the same.
It's our therapy to understand. And I've dealt with, one of the images I showed was an image of it was just a time when I lost my brother from AIDS, and then I was pregnant with my daughter. And just that exchange of life and death and where the spirit comes from, you know, there's so many questions. And you know, he died when he was 47, and just an amazing mind, and, you know, the questions of why. And,
Right.
you know, things you can't answer, but you can, you know, I think art just asks more questions than it answers anything. But
Yeah. But it gives you that space to ground yourself and figure out, you know, something, even if it's just the asking of the question, you know. Yeah. Photography and truth. That's true. We didn't talk about photography and truth. Yes.
That was
Well,
one
we
of my
alluded to it
favorites.
when we were talking about the document and, you know, the relationship between photographic truth and fiction in our work. We did talk a little bit about there, but we can also ask the question, and what's the relationship between what's actually there and memory or the imagination? But, you know, the whole idea of the power of photography as evidence versus fiction, you know, that's, I think, present in all of our work.
I think that one of the last images that they show of my work, it was an image that is created with 50% an image of my father and 50% an image of me. And it's because that series is called Duplicity as Identity. And it's the idea that, I think that this is something that I believe is that we all have very different personalities. We have multiple selves in a way. So when is it that we are really ourselves to people? Because I can be standing here and I can talk in a way that maybe I would not talk if I am in a different situation or environment and that type of thing. So it's almost like the sense of evolving and changing, the sense of deceitfulness, because we're not, you know, in a way photography is that, because it deceives in many ways. It can lie. You know, I remember going online one day when I heard that on eBay they were selling a sandwich because it had a grilled cheese sandwich because it had the image of the Virgin Mary. So I go online and sure enough I saw the Virgin Mary in the sandwich. And I realized that it was because I went looking for the Virgin Mary, you know, and it's that idea that you go with a preconceived idea. You know, you're looking at an image of crime and you see a crime in a way. If we erase that sense of identity and we erase that title and that, you know, name of the photograph, what is it that we will see? You know, and in a sense is where, you know, if we erase that we are Latinas, what will we be? You know? If we erase that our last names, you know, if I would be Maria Smith, you know, what would it be? I mean, would I not talk with my hands, you know, with the passion and the drama of, you know, it's something that you wonder because it's never, when is it that is true? And the truth in particular.
Yeah, well, there's always, it's like a prism, you know, so, I mean, when we make photographs, we're only looking at, you know, when you make a photograph, you look at this particular space. Of course, you could make 1,000 photographs of one thing and try to get approximate to, or more closer to the truth. But it's definitely.
Well, it's funny because I teach history of photography. So the first week we look at the first photographs and the wonder of creating images where you could count every brick on a building and how excited they were about that. And then the second week I go, okay, and here are the manipulations where they photographed the commune art activities and lied about it and everybody got killed. And here are, you know, Robinson and Rylander, and they're all inventing their little dramas. And so it's like, okay, there goes reality out the window. You think digital is new, you think composites are new, here you go, 1857. So here they are. But then, having said that, I look at the work of someone like James Nachtwey, whose work I absolutely adore. And I believe his images because I want to believe, because he's so committed to telling me the truth about how things are somewhere. And it's a difficult truth to look at. And I do believe that that is what he saw, that is what was there. And so it's always this back and forth for me. And because I realize that he's telling his truth and I'm telling my truth. And that the truth I'm telling may not be what's right in front of me, but that it's also a truth.
Yeah, there's an authenticity to it.
There's a different kind of truth. But I still love his truth very much.
Yes.
Okay.
Dying to ask.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh, yeah, really.
The Cuban death comment, I really wanted to hear what you would say if a Cuban photographer was depicting those last moments toward death with a camera. How might it tell the story versus the story that her mother allowed her to tell with the camera?
Good question. I mean, I cannot speak for every single Cuban.
What do you mean?
It's interesting because I remember when Susan Sontag died, and Annie Leibovitz photographed her. I remember that my first reaction is that I was a little shocked. Because a loved one has photographed, the person that she loved in that moment. And I mean, I don't know what I would do if that is the case in my case. But we deal I think that in Mexico they celebrate the date of the death. We don't celebrate. We cry. And we cry. With the drama, because everything gets intensified. I think that there's something about, being Cuban for me, at least, that, when it's not a simple emotion, it's an emotion times 10 times, times 10. So, death is, I am afraid of dying. I mean, I would lie if I tell you that I'm not, because I am. And I think about it, and I'm petrified of the chronology of time. But I think that for me, photographing somebody, if it's very close to me, I don't think I could be able to do it. I think that the eye would be much more important. I remember that I had this friend of mine who passed away in 1997 who was like a brother to me, and the last 6 months of his life I took care of him. When we went to bury him, we flew his body to Puerto Rico. He's another Cuban who grew up in Puerto Rico, but his parents were in Puerto Rico, and they asked us if, us, his friends, if it would be okay to bury him in Puerto Rico. And we say absolutely. So a group of us went with the body on the plane, to Puerto Rico. And I remember when we arrived in the funeral home, because I was the person in charge of his affairs, I asked the guy from the funeral home to open the casket because I wanted to make sure that he was there. Because if I don't see it, I don't believe it. And that's something that to me, because I'm a visual person, I need to relate very much to evidence. If I see it there, I believe it. Now in photography, I don't. But if I see it there in person, I do. Photography, I think, is about looking. It's about observation. It's about discovering. I mean, photograph talk to me. I mean, I was looking at Annie Leibowitz's images of Susan Sontag, and I not only look at Susan Sontag, but I started studying everything on that photographic image. And that's what I love, is that I feel that I was getting more than just a photograph of a person. I was getting a story, made by fragments of just paying attention to everything that was there. I hope I answered your question.
It's Maria Martinez-Cañas, the Cuban, answering the question.
It's a little complicated.
Other questions?
Hi. I was just wondering, as artists of various backgrounds who may or may not identify themselves as Latina or Latino, what has been your exhibition experience in terms of how your work is presented? How has it not been presented that you would like to see in the future, it being presented in that way? I'm just curious, because there's so much debate over culturally specific exhibitions. What's an appropriate frame for considering your work?
We were talking a little bit about
because
that.
we are, you mean because we are Latinas?
Or because we are artists.
Okay, that's the
That's
question.
the
Yeah, that's
question.
the question.
I think that we were talking about that
Yes,
yesterday.
yes. I
in
have an
terms of-
opinion on that.
Yeah,
but I'm gonna,
that, you know, we were,
no.
well, anyway, I'll start it. That we were discussing that, you know, just like I said early on that, you know, when I came to this country is when I discovered that I was a Latina. I remember early on having conversations with curators and saying, I want to be an artist. I don't want to be a Latina artist only, you know? And so I think that that is something that, especially at the beginning of our careers, it was much more difficult to find places to exhibit our work as artists, period. And so being labeled as only one thing is problematic. And I think that we would all feel similarly from the conversation we had yesterday, but I mean, I'll let you guys talk.
I think that for me at least, when you start a career in the arts, and as difficult as it is to be an artist, as the limitations of the possibility of exhibiting your work, especially when you're a 20-something, because it's very much in fashion to be 20-something now, but 20-something years ago, it was not. Okay, so nobody took us seriously. Nobody wanted, I was living in Chicago, let's say when I was 23, 24, and I remember that the only place that I exhibit was either in a park, as part of a fair, and Celia Cruz sang and everything, or the Mexican Art Center. And I exhibit in shows for Latino art because it was an opportunity for me to start exhibiting, okay? The same with women's show. You know, as a woman, I was included in exhibitions of women art, and I say yes because, again, I was building a resume, but at one time in my life I say no more because I felt that it was, if I stay only between women shows or Latina shows, it's almost like you create this ghetto, and I was not interested in that. The day that the Smithsonian acquired one of my works, I loved it, but I loved it because it was acquired by the Department of Photography, not because of where I was born. It was because of the importance, I think, you know, of the meaning of my work within the history of photography. And as a photographer, that was very important to me. You know, I don't want people, I mean, if the reason why somebody acquires my work is because I am Cuban, that's a valid reason for somebody, and I mean, I have to respect that, but at the same time, I want to be, you know, I'm much more than just a Cuban-born, Puerto Rican-grown American citizen. I am, you know, I'm an artist, and I'm influenced by a lot of other things, and in that sense, that I think is happened to all of us. I mean,
Right. No, I would agree with that.
I think historically for me, I've had my ins and outs and my ups and downs with what I was defined as. Because when I first started exhibiting, some of my first exhibits were with Gonzalo, and I was just so happy to be exhibiting at all. And it was at that time, I was talking about this morning, the Chicano art movement was in Texas almost exclusively a boys' club. There were a few Latinas in the Chicano movement. At the same time, the women's movement was happening, and it was almost all white women. So we were going like this, you know. And then, so I started with Gonzalo, and I was so happy to be doing things, but then I found that it was a limited experience for me because they wanted me to do a certain type of work, and that didn't work. So I left Gonzalo and went and did a number of different things. I went to grad school after that, and it was very male and very white. And they didn't want me doing anything that looked like women's work, and they didn't want me doing anything that looked Latino. And so I got it into my head, and they kept drilling it in. You must be mainstream to be successful. You must make a certain type of art. Your art must look a certain way. And so here I come bouncing out of grad school with this idea hooked in my head and land right in the middle of the Guadalupe, which was completely Chicano, which was completely political, which was completely, let's go burn down City Hall. Not really, but kind of that, let's go talk to our city council person, let's elect a Latino mayor, all of this activity. And I realized how important it was for me to be an outspoken Chicana Latina, and how important it was. All those, I kind of went the other way. I realized how important all of those Chicano shows were. Mm-hmm. How important it was for, we were in the middle of a community that was almost all housing projects, very low income people, and to try to drag those kids into classes, it was so important to be not only out in the art world, but to be in the Chicano world. It just really became a whole different take for me. Having said that, I'm very happy to be in the Smithsonian's collection. I was very happy to go to lunch with Laura because we got to meet the wife of the president of Mexico, who was like, at that time, Mexico's Evita, so it was like really cool. And one of my pieces was also acquired, the cross piece was also acquired by the Toledo Museum. And so shortly after they acquired that, the Toledo Friends of Photography asked me to go up there to do a talk. And so the Toledo Museum hung my piece, and they hung it right next to the Star Twins. And I thought, oh, wow, this is so cool. I'm hanging next to the Star Twins. So I had to have fun with that, too.
Right. And we were talking about this last night, just about everybody likes to label, and it's, I think, just a way to understand. And my work has been labeled in multiple ways, but predominantly digitally based because of the early 1990s and the success I had at that period. And it's kind of the same thing, putting in a show under the frame of digital or Latin. And it calls to mind, when I was a graduate student, I got called because of my background, to be in a show at the School of the Art Institute, a part of the whole. And I argued with the people, saying, well, if I was really a part of the whole, you wouldn't need the show, because I'd be part of the whole thing. And so I didn't participate. And it's sort of funny when you do and when you don't participate. Right. I even debated with Nona here when she invited me to, but I don't consider myself just that. But identity is a constantly moving, evolving thing. Yeah. And so I guess we, in our desire to be artists, we exhibit, and to get our work out there.
Yeah. And then to answer your question, I think that, what I would like is for somebody to understand, where the work comes from with all its cultural baggage, if it has it, and but to put it in that context, to put it in a particular context, which is this kind of fluid and hybrid kind of place, and I think that it's not necessarily one particular thing, but it is many different things, and so I think the acknowledgement of that and educating everybody about that is actually really valuable. And I think why we're doing this in the end, because we realize that in the dialogue, there comes an understanding and perhaps a development of the ideas about what it means to be a Latina artist living in the U.S. So.
And if I could just add one thing, I think the issue is still ongoing for younger artists, very much, because I know just as I was leaving the Guadalupe, I had a young man call me at the same school I went to, and in 2000, he was being told by his teachers not to make work that looked cultural, and they were actually calling his cultural art political. He called me up, he said, I'm in trouble because I'm making political art. I said, what are you doing? And he said, portraits. And I said, Che? You know, why are portraits political? And then we had to talk about political and cultural and the fact that it was okay for him to be doing that. So if this discussion is still ongoing in 2000, I'm assuming it's still ongoing in this day, in 2010, and I keep wondering how much longer. This is why, by the way, I decided to teach at a university. I kept wondering how much longer the conversation was going to continue in universities. The idea that your art must look a certain way for you to fit.
Well, you know what is interesting to me is that when I had my at the Art Institute in Chicago, when you at the end of my MFA, you have the critique, the last critique, and I remember that one teacher asked me, well, where is the Latin Americanism in your work? And I was appalled about that. Because,
Right.
I mean, I don't remember that if I want to be myself, that has to come out on the work specifically. I felt that I was being the most honest possible. But it was not but that took me back because it was almost like, what you say, it's almost like, it's disrespected just because, my last name is Martinez.
Yeah, it's either one or the other. It's, okay, you've got this last name, so for God's sake, don't make Latino art, or you've got this last name, so why aren't you making art that looks more Latino? It's always one or the other. It's never oh,
and
good,
the other
here you
and
are.
the other thing that happens a lot, or at least that happened to me in the beginning of my career, and sometimes occasionally, is that the work would be called magical realism, and so it was put in the context of 100 years of solitude and the rest of the just because that was the thing that was popular and happening, and because there were dreamlike qualities to it, or that there were elusive qualities to it, and I mean I found that very reductive. That it's not that it couldn't be part of that context, but it wasn't just that. So another. There was another one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Good.
That's it.